Hey guys, tonight we're floating back to the Roman Empire, but not the glamorous Rome you see in movies with marble statues gleaming under Mediterranean sunsets. No, tonight we're diving into the entire long rise and very, very drawn-out fall of Rome, a journey so vast, so unnecessarily complicated, and so full of dysfunctional people in togas that honestly, it's perfect bedtime material. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back, about 2,500 years ago, when the Italian peninsula was less empire of the world and more a random boot-shaped landmass full of villages that couldn't stop fighting each other. Rome, in the beginning, wasn't even the big deal of Italy. It was just a scrappy settlement on a hill with a river nearby. A river, by the way, that was basically a slow-moving mudslide called the Tiber. People fished in it, bathed in it, dumped things in it, and somehow survived. Rome started small, not much different than dozens of other little towns scattered around Latium. But unlike most, Rome had ambition. Or, to be more accurate, Rome had neighbors who kept poking them, so the Romans had to get good at fighting back. And then they just never stopped. But before we go too far into the empire stuff, we should talk about the Romans' favorite origin story. Because Rome couldn't just be a village that got lucky. No, it had to be epic. So they came up with the tale of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers, abandoned by their mother, raised by a wolf. Because, of course. And when they grew up, they decided to found a city together. Which is adorable, except they immediately argued about where to put it, and Romulus solved the disagreement by killing Remus. Yes, from day one, Rome's foundational vibe was family is optional, conquest is mandatory. Now, did that wolf-raising thing actually happen? Almost certainly not. But the Romans loved this story. It set the tone. It meant that from the very beginning, Rome's identity was tied to violence, ambition, and sibling rivalry, all things they would export in bulk over the next few centuries. So after the mythical wolf children, Rome was said to have kings, 7 of them, according to tradition, which, if you're familiar with later Roman politics, was basically 7 too many. The early kings supposedly built temples, drained swamps, and set up traditions. But eventually, as always happens in monarchies, someone got too full of himself. His name was Tarquin the Proud, which honestly is not a great branding choice. Tarquin ruled like an arrogant tyrant, and the Romans got fed up. They had a rebellion, kicked him out, and declared no more kings, which is a strong statement. Except instead of monarchy, they created a republic, which was basically just a monarchy disguised as an oligarchy where a bunch of rich families took turns bossing everyone around. But hey, at least they didn't call themselves kings anymore. Now, the republic was a strange hybrid. It had consuls, who were like temporary kings, but with expiration dates. It had the Senate, which was full of cranky old men yelling about tradition. And it had assemblies, where the common people could technically vote, though usually in a way that benefited the rich. So, basically, it was politics, ancient style. The Republic did have one unique feature, though, an obsession with balance. They hated the idea of one person having too much power, which sounds very noble until you realize this meant they created endless layers of bureaucracy and checks that made decision-making slower than molasses. But Rome made up for its clunky politics by being very good at 2 things, making war and writing laws. And oh boy, the wars. Rome's early neighbors were not thrilled about their growing confidence. The Etruscans, the Samnites, the Latins, all these little groups got into brawls with Rome. The Romans would lose some battles, learn from them, and then come back stronger. It was like that slow, centuries-long workout routine. Rome was basically that gym bro who starts out weak but shows up every day until suddenly he's bench pressing half the Mediterranean. And the thing is, Rome didn't just conquer, they absorbed. If you were defeated by Rome, they didn't always destroy you. Sometimes they offered citizenship, or partial citizenship, or at least some perks for not rebelling, which made their empire unusually stable compared to other ancient conquerors. It was like, sure, we beat you, but now you can join the team. Isn't that nice? So, by the 3rd century BCE, Rome had gobbled up most of Italy, which left one obvious question. Who's next? The answer came in the form of Carthage. Carthage was a powerful trading empire in North Africa, rich from commerce, with shiny ships and a professional military. Rome, on the other hand, was a land empire, with a knack for improvising. The two clashed in what we now call the Punic Wars. The First Punic War was mainly at sea, which Rome was terrible at. They basically had no navy, so they did what Rome always did, copied their enemies. They literally stole Carthaginian ship designs and cranked out their own fleet, adding a special boarding plank so they could turn sea battles into land battles, which was very on brand. And eventually, Rome won. But Carthage didn't go away. Cue Hannibal, one of history's most famous generals. He marched his army, complete with war elephants, over the Alps to invade Italy, which was insane. Imagine trudging elephants through freezing mountains. Not exactly the most practical commute, but somehow he pulled it off. Hannibal wrecked the Romans in battle after battle. At Cannae, he slaughtered tens of thousands of Roman soldiers in one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. The Romans were terrified. But here's the thing about Rome. They refused to give up. Even after losing entire armies, they just kept raising new ones. It was like playing whack-a-mole, but the mole is armed and keeps coming back angrier. Eventually, Rome turned the tables. They sent a general named Scipio Africanus to invade Carthage itself. Hannibal had to rush home, and at the Battle of Zama, Rome finally won. Carthage was humbled, and Rome was officially the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. Now, at this point, Rome could have relaxed. They could have said, all right, we've got Italy, we've got Spain, we've got a solid Mediterranean beachhead, let's just chill. But no, Rome never chilled. Instead, they looked east and started meddling in Greek affairs. And by meddling, I mean conquering. The Greeks, who prided themselves on philosophy and culture, suddenly found themselves under Roman boots. To be fair, the Romans were obsessed with Greek culture. They stole Greek gods, Greek art, Greek education, basically everything except Greek democracy, which they thought was a little too chaotic. So while they admired Greece, they also crushed it. Typical Roman behavior. So by the 2nd century BCE, Rome controlled a massive territory stretching from Spain to Asia Minor. But here's the problem. Success made Rome messy. The Republic wasn't built to manage such a huge empire. The Senate tried to keep control, but rich generals started getting more power than the politicians. Land was gobbled up by elites, the poor were squeezed out, and social tensions exploded. Cue the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They tried to reform things, giving land back to the poor and curbing elite corruption. Noble, right? Except the Senate hated it, so both brothers ended up dead. Because, apparently, in the Roman Republic, suggesting social reform was basically a death sentence. From then on, politics got bloodier. Generals like Marius and Sulla raised their own armies, loyal to them personally, not the state. Civil wars broke out. Sulla even marched his army into Rome itself, which was absolutely not supposed to happen. But, well, it happened. And this chaos set the stage for a little-known guy you may have heard of. His name was Julius Caesar. Now, Caesar didn't appear out of nowhere. He was part of the elite, but he had ambition dripping from every pore. He made alliances, he charmed people, he threw extravagant games to get popular. Classic politician stuff. But what really made him rise was his military campaigns, especially in Gaul. Caesar spent years conquering Gaul, modern France and Belgium, and wrote reports back to Rome that basically made him look like the superhero of the century. And the Romans loved it.
The Senate, however, got nervous. Caesar was becoming too powerful. They told him to disband his army and come home quietly, which, of course, he didn't do. Instead, in 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his army, essentially declaring civil war. That little phrase, crossing the Rubicon, comes from this moment. And Caesar won. His rival Pompey fled, battles were fought, and eventually Caesar became the undisputed ruler of Rome. He was given the title dictator for life, which sounded nice at first, but then people started remembering that Rome didn't like kings, and dictator for life sounded a lot like king. So some senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, decided to stab him, literally. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, Caesar was killed in the Senate by a bunch of men pretending they were safe.
So, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. He was careful, though. He didn't call himself king, because, remember, Romans were allergic to that word. Instead, he wrapped himself in titles like princeps, meaning first citizen, which sounds humble until you realize it meant, I'm technically just like you, but I get to make all the decisions. And the Senate? Still there, still grumpy, but now more like a decorative antique in the corner. Augustus was surprisingly good at the emperor thing. He lived a long time, kept Rome relatively peaceful, and made sure the empire looked stable. He even boasted about bringing back traditional Roman values, which, if you've ever studied history, is the equivalent of every politician's favorite promise, the good old days. Spoiler, they never actually existed. But Augustus had one big problem: family drama. He didn't have a straightforward heir, so he kept adopting relatives, grooming them, and then they kept dying, mysteriously, or inconveniently. It was basically the world's least fun talent show. Eventually, after much chaos, the empire landed in the hands of his stepson, Tiberius. Tiberius was not exactly a people person. He was smart, yes, and competent in some ways, but he also had the charisma of wet bread. He didn't like crowds, didn't like public games, and he definitely didn't like being emperor, which is awkward considering that was literally his job. Eventually, Tiberius just gave up on Rome altogether. He moved to the island of Capri, where he surrounded himself with astrologers, sycophants, and, let's just say, questionable personal hobbies. The Senate back in Rome ran the show, while Tiberius basically ghosted the empire. He ruled for over 20 years, which feels impressive, until you realize most people just remember him as the emperor who hid on an island because he couldn't stand people. Relatable, but not very imperial. After Tiberius came one of Rome's most infamous emperors, Caligula. His real name was Gaius, but as a child, he wore a cute little military outfit that earned him the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots. Imagine being one of the most feared rulers in history, but everyone knows you by your childhood nickname. It's like being called Emperor Sippy Cup. At first, people loved Caligula. Young, energetic, charming, the empire sighed in relief. Finally, someone fun after decades of Tiberius sulking on Capri. But then, well, then things got weird. Very weird. Caligula started spending money like Rome was an unlimited credit card. He held extravagant games, gave out bonuses, built massive projects. All fine, except the treasury wasn't infinite. And when he needed more cash, he got creative. He declared wars just so he could loot temples. He taxed random things, including weddings and lawsuits. He even supposedly declared that soldiers should collect seashells as spoils of war, which, yes, sounds fake, but it might actually be true. Then there were his personal quirks. He allegedly made his horse, Incitatus, a priest, and maybe even a consul, though that part might be exaggeration. Still, the fact that anyone believed it tells you a lot about his reign. He also loved being called a god, demanded statues of himself in temples, and liked to terrify senators by inviting them to dinner, then casually hinting he might have them executed. Charming dinner guest. After just 4 years, the Senate and the Praetorian Guard decided they'd had enough. Caligula was assassinated, stabbed to death in a palace corridor. And suddenly, the Rome needed a new emperor. Enter Claudius. Claudius was Caligula's uncle, and at first, people weren't sure about him. He had a limp, a stammer, and had been sidelined his whole life as the family oddball. Basically, nobody thought he was capable of running Rome, which honestly may have saved his life under Tiberius and Caligula. Being underestimated is sometimes the best protection. But once he was emperor, Claudius surprised everyone. He was awkward in public, yes, but he was intelligent, scholarly, and surprisingly effective. He reorganized the empire, built aqueducts, and even conquered Britain. Or at least part of it, because full Britain would prove way too stubborn. Unfortunately, Claudius had terrible luck with women. His marriages were disasters, filled with betrayals and poisonings. His most infamous wife was Agrippina the Younger. She was ambitious, ruthless, and determined to get her son Nero on the throne, and, well, she succeeded. Claudius died in suspicious circumstances, likely poisoned by Agrippina, and Nero became emperor at the tender age of 16. Now, Nero. Where do we even begin? At first, like Caligula, Nero seemed promising. He gave bonuses to soldiers, held games, and was cheered by the people. He even had the wise philosopher Seneca as his tutor. But, as usual, power plus personal insecurities equals chaos. Nero wanted to be loved not as a statesman, but as an artist. He adored music, poetry, and acting, which is fine, unless you're the emperor of Rome. The elite were horrified. In Roman culture, performing on stage was considered low class, basically the equivalent of your head of state starting a TikTok channel. But Nero didn't care. He sang in public, acted in plays, and forced audiences to watch him perform. And nobody was allowed to leave the theater until he was done. Imagine being locked in for hours, listening to your emperor's open mic night. Torture by boredom. Then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Half the city burned down. Rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered it, either to clear space for his new palace or just because he liked the spectacle. The famous story is that he fiddled while Rome burned, though fiddles didn't actually exist yet. Probably he just sang. Either way, not a great look. To deflect blame, Nero accused the Christians. At the time, they were a tiny, unpopular sect, perfect scapegoats. Nero unleashed brutal persecutions, with horrific executions staged as public entertainment. It was one of the darkest moments of his reign. But even beyond the fire, Nero's rule spiraled. He killed his mother, Agrippina, after she became too controlling. He killed his wife, then he killed his next wife. He went on tour in Greece, forcing locals to cheer his performances. Meanwhile, back home, the empire started crumbling. Rebellions broke out, the treasury emptied, and the Senate finally turned against him. In 68 CE, Nero lost support. Declared a public enemy, he fled the city. Cornered, he took his own life, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies in me," which honestly might be the most Nero thing he could have said. So after Nero, what did Rome do? It collapsed into chaos, naturally. Within 1 year, 4 different men claimed the throne: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally, Vespasian. This was the year of the 4 emperors, which sounds dramatic, but really just meant Rome was having another one of its reality TV-style meltdowns. Vespasian emerged victorious, founding the Flavian dynasty. He was practical, no nonsense, and famous for building the Colosseum. Yes, the Colosseum, Rome's giant stone stadium, still standing today.
And he funded it partly by taxing public toilets, which is why the Latin phrase for money, pecunia non olec, literally means money doesn't stink. Thanks Vespasian. His sons, Titus and Domitian, carried on. Titus was popular, known for his kindness and for finishing the Colosseum. He also had the misfortune of ruling during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, which buried Pompeii. And then, just to add to his unlucky resume, a plague and a fire hit Rome too. Poor Titus. He died young, and people actually mourned him, which was unusual for a Roman emperor. Then came Domitian, his brother. Domitian ruled for years, but became increasingly paranoid. He executed senators, alienated the elite, and insisted on being called Lord and God, which, subtle. Eventually, a palace conspiracy got rid of him. And with that, Rome moved on to a new dynasty, the Nervan Antonines, which, to be fair, gave the empire some of its best emperors. But don't get too comfortable, because as always, the dysfunction wasn't far behind.
So, after Domitian was assassinated in 96 CE, the Senate, in its usual panic mode, needed someone safe, someone calm, someone not interested in calling himself Lord and God. They landed on Nerva. Nerva was an older senator, steady but, honestly, kind of bland, which was exactly what Rome needed. He ruled for just 2 years, but his real legacy was adopting a successor, Trajan. And this kicked off a trend of what historians call the adoptive emperors. Basically, instead of passing power to a dodgy biological son, the emperor picked a capable adult heir. Revolutionary idea, right? For Rome, it was like inventing sliced bread. Trajan turned out to be one of Rome's best rulers. He expanded the empire to its greatest size, pushing into Dacia, modern-day Romania, and Mesopotamia. Dacia was especially lucrative because of its gold mines, and Trajan, unlike so many emperors, actually used that wealth for public works. He built Trajan's Forum, Trajan's Market, and Trajan's Column, which still stands today, spiraling up with carved scenes of his military campaigns. Basically, he left Rome a giant stone comic book of how awesome he was. Subtle. But despite all his conquests, Trajan knew when to stop. The empire was huge, resources were stretched thin, and endless expansion wasn't sustainable. When he died in 117 CE, people actually mourned him. He set the gold standard for emperors, literally. Later Romans would bless new rulers with the phrase, "May you be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan," which is high praise in a society that didn't exactly hand out compliments. Next came Hadrian, Trajan's adopted heir. Hadrian is best remembered for building walls, lots of them. Most famously, Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, meant to keep out the Picts, those stubborn tribes who refused to be Romanized. The wall wasn't really a fortress, more like a glorified fence with forts attached, but it sent a clear message. This is the edge. Beyond here, good luck. Hadrian was also obsessed with architecture. He built the Pantheon we know today with its massive dome that still blows architects' minds. He loved Greek culture, traveled constantly, and tried to keep the empire stable rather than expanding further. On the downside, he had a bit of a control freak streak and wasn't above crushing revolts brutally, like the Jewish Bar Kokhba rebellion. Still, compared to some emperors, Hadrian looks almost reasonable. After Hadrian came Antoninus Pius, who, true to his name, was dutiful, mild, and peaceful. He basically presided over 2 decades of calm, which means historians often skip over him. Poor guy. You rule competently, keep things stable, avoid scandal, and you're remembered as the boring emperor. But honestly, for Rome, boring was a blessing. Then came Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. If you've ever read Meditations, that's him. Stoic musings, reflections on mortality, the universe, duty. It's all very calming, very deep, and also very clear that this man needed a therapist. Marcus Aurelius was thoughtful, wise, and diligent. Unfortunately, he also had terrible luck. His reign was plagued, literally. A pandemic, the Antonine Plague, swept through the empire, killing millions. On top of that, endless wars with Germanic tribes drained resources. Marcus spent much of his life on campaign, living in military camps rather than palaces, which for a philosopher king is kind of ironic. And then the one mistake everyone remembers him for, his son, Commodus. Yes, after decades of emperors adopting competent heirs, Marcus Aurelius decided to go old school and pass the throne to his biological child, which went about as well as you'd expect. Commodus became emperor in 180 CE. He was only 18, unprepared, spoiled, and had none of his father's wisdom. While Marcus was scribbling deep thoughts about virtue, Commodus was dressing up as Hercules and demanding people worship him as a living god. He also loved gladiator fights, not just watching them, participating in them. Of course, he made sure he always won. He'd go into the arena armed with real weapons, while his opponents got wooden ones, which, to be fair, is one way to guarantee a win-loss record. He also fought exotic animals, though he often had them chained up or weakened first. It was less gladiator champion and more spoiled rich kid with a blood sport hobby. Meanwhile, actual governance, not his thing. He left administration to corrupt favorites, drained the treasury, and indulged his whims. He renamed months after himself, renamed Rome itself after himself, and spent more time in costume than in council. The Senate hated him. The people started turning. Even his inner circle got fed up. Eventually, a conspiracy formed. Commodus was poisoned, and when that didn't finish the job, he was strangled. His death ended the Antonine dynasty and threw Rome into yet another familiar spiral: civil war. This time it was called the Year of the Five Emperors, because apparently one wasn't enough. The throne changed hands rapidly through assassinations, mutinies, and bribery. And in the end, Severus Severus came out on top. Which is a nice segue, because we're now entering the Severn dynasty. Spoiler, things get even messier. But before we leave Marcus Aurelius behind, it's worth pausing. He tried so hard to embody virtue, wisdom, and Dewey, and all it took was one heir to undo it. Rome had enjoyed nearly a century of relative stability under these good emperors, and now the slow decline was setting in.
So, Commodus is dead, finally. The Senate breathes a sigh of relief, then immediately panics, because killing an emperor is one thing, replacing him is another. Thus begins the Year of the Five Emperors, because in Rome, why settle for one bad leader when you can audition 5 in a row? At first, they picked Pertinax. He was a capable senator, disciplined, old-school Roman virtues and all that. The problem? He tried to reform the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, who by this point were less protectors and more armed mafia. They didn't like being told to behave, so after just 3 months, they stabbed him. Next, the throne literally went up for auction. The Praetorians shouted to the highest bidder, "Who wants to be emperor?" And a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus basically said, "Sure, I'll pay." Yes, Rome once sold the empire like it was a used chariot. Unsurprisingly, this did not inspire confidence in the provinces. So, rival generals threw their hats in the ring. Septimius Severus, a commander from the provinces, marched on Rome, defeated his rivals, and declared himself emperor. And just like that, the Severan dynasty began. Septimius Severus was tough, ruthless, and militaristic. He basically told the Senate, "Sit down, shut up, and look decorative," while he leaned hard on the army. He raised soldiers' pay, rewarded loyalty, and made it clear Rome was now a military monarchy. Forget the old republican illusions. The Senate still met, but its relevance was about as strong as a paper helmet. Severus expanded the empire in the East and in Africa, but he also drained the treasury with constant wars. His family situation didn't help either. His Syrian wife, Julia Domna, was influential and ambitious, and their two sons, Caracalla and Geta, hated each other, as in try to kill each other in the palace levels of hatred. When Severus died in 211 CE, he supposedly told his sons, "Stick together, pay the soldiers, forget everyone else," which was very fatherly advice. They immediately ignored it. Caracalla and Geta tried ruling jointly, but within a year, Caracalla murdered his brother during a supposed peace meeting. He then ordered a purge of Geta's supporters, killed thousands, and erased his brother's name from inscriptions. Classic Roman sibling bonding. Caracalla is remembered for two big things. One, the Constitutio Antoniniana, which granted Roman citizenship to basically all free men in the empire. Sounds generous, right? But really, it was a tax grab. More citizens meant more taxpayers. Clever, if a bit cynical. Two, his massive public baths in Rome. The baths of Caracalla were extravagant. Marble halls, hot pools, cold pools, libraries, gardens. You could spend an entire day there soaking and gossiping. They still stand in ruins today, proving Caracalla was better at architecture than sibling diplomacy. But Caracalla also had a vicious streak. He massacred thousands in Alexandria after they mocked him. He spent most of his reign on campaign, paranoid and violent. Eventually, one of his own bodyguards stabbed him while he was relieving himself on the side of the road. Dignified end for an emperor who thought he was Alexander the Great reborn. After him came a brief reign by Macrinus, then Elagabalus. Now, Elagabalus deserves his own bedtime story. He was a teenager, brought to power by his grandmother, Julia Maesa, and he quickly scandalized Rome. Elagabalus was obsessed with the Syrian sun god Eliagal and tried to force Romans to worship him above Jupiter. He built a huge temple, paraded the god's sacred black stone through the city, and insisted on performing bizarre rituals. Romans, who loved their traditions, were not impressed. He also shocked elites with his personal life. Ancient sources, which, granted, are often biased, describe him as extravagant, gender non-conforming, and wild in his sexual appetites. He married multiple times, including, allegedly, a Vestal virgin, which was a huge religious taboo. He dressed flamboyantly, supposedly offered vast sums to any doctor who could perform surgery to give him female anatomy, and generally horrified the Senate. Needless to say, his reign didn't last. After 4 years, the Praetorian Guard killed him and his mother, dragging their bodies through the streets. Rome, always tolerant until it wasn't. After Elagabalus came his cousin, Severus Alexander, another teenager, but much a calmer one. Guided by his mother and advisors, he tried to bring stability back. He was earnest, polite, and, according to many, simply too nice for the job. Soldiers grew restless with his indecisive leadership, and in 235 CE, during a campaign against the Germans, his own troops murdered him and his mother in their tent. And with that, the Severan dynasty ended. But Rome's problems were only just beginning. The empire was huge, stretched thin, and constantly under attack on all fronts. Armies began proclaiming their generals emperor whenever they felt like it, leading to civil wars that weakened defenses. Meanwhile, plague, inflation, and corruption ate away at the core. Historians call the next period the crisis of the 3rd century, which is putting it politely. It was basically a 50-year free-for-all where emperors came and went faster than a Netflix login rotation. In some years, 3 or 4 different men claimed the throne, most of them meeting violent ends. The empire even split into breakaway states at times, like the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. Rome, the eternal city, was looking pretty shaky, but somehow through sheer stubbornness, it survived. The real glue wasn't the Senate or even emperors. It was the army. Rome's legions kept patching things together, though at great cost. And the constant instability meant that emperors were now chosen less by lineage or politics and more by whichever general had the biggest loyal army. The Severans had shifted Rome into a military monarchy. And now, that model took over fully. From here on, emperors were basically warlords in purple robes. Some lasted years, some lasted months, many never got around to governing at all.
Rome, 235 CE. The Severans are gone. The last young emperor, Severus Alexander, lies dead in a muddy German camp, cut down by his own soldiers. The message is clear. The legions now decide who rules. If they don't like you, you won't last long. And if you think Commodus was bad, the next 50 years make him look almost stable. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century. Crisis is a polite word. It was half a century of civil wars, foreign invasions, plagues, assassinations, and emperors who dropped like flies. Rome wasn't just wobbling, it was teetering on collapse. The age of soldier emperors. The man who replaced Severus Alexander was Maximinus Thrax, a giant of a soldier from Thrace. He wasn't from the senatorial elite. He was a commoner, a career soldier who supposedly stood over 8 feet tall, though that's probably exaggeration. He ate and drank like an ox, spoke with a rough provincial accent, and didn't care for Roman traditions. The Senate hated him, but the army adored him because he promised higher pay and revenge on the Germans. Maximinus spent his reign on campaign, barely setting foot in Rome. He taxed heavily to fund the army, angering the people. Within 3 years, uprisings began. In Africa, local elites revolted and declared their own emperors. Then came Gordian I and his son Gordian II, elderly aristocrats who were quickly crushed. The Senate backed them, but Maximinus marched to suppress the rebellion. The Senate panicked. They declared Maximinus a public enemy and chose new emperors, Pupienus and Balbinus, 2 senators meant to share power. But the Roman people hated them, the Praetorian Guard distrusted them, and the whole situation was a mess. Maximinus was assassinated by his own soldiers during a siege in 238. Pupienus and Balbinus were then murdered by the Praetorians. It was called the Year of the 6 Emperors, and it was only the beginning. The Gordians, the Philips, and the Decii. After all that blood, the Senate turned to a teenager, Gordian III, grandson of the earlier Gordian. He ruled with advisors guiding him, but inexperience in palace politics made him weak. He campaigned against the new rising enemy in the east, the Sassanid Persians, who had replaced the Parthians and were much tougher opponents. Gordian died in mysterious circumstances in 244. Some say illness, others say his own general, Philip, betrayed him. Either way, Philip seized power. He became known as Philip the Arab, one of the first emperors from the eastern provinces. Philip ruled during Rome's 1000th anniversary in 248, celebrating with grand games and spectacles. But his reign was unstable. In the provinces, generals declared themselves emperors left and right. In 249, one of them, Decius, defeated Philip in battle and became emperor himself. Decius tried to restore old Roman values. He ordered empire-wide sacrifices to the traditional gods, hoping to please them and bring back stability. This led to one of the first empire-wide persecutions of Christians who refused to sacrifice. But the gods weren't impressed. In 251, Decius fought the Goths in the Balkans and became the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy. That was a bad omen. The chaos deepens. After Decius, things unraveled even faster. Emperors came and went in a blur. Valerian became emperor in 253, ruling with his son Gallienus. Valerian tried to face the Sassanids in the east, but disaster struck. In 260, the Persian king Shapur I defeated him and, humiliatingly,
captured him alive. This was unprecedented. No Roman emperor had ever been taken prisoner. Shapur paraded Valerian around like a trophy. Ancient sources claim Valerian was used as a human footstool to help the Persian king mount his horse. Eventually, he died in captivity, his skin supposedly stuffed and displayed as a warning. Whether that's true or exaggerated, it shattered Roman prestige. Back in Rome, Gallienus was left alone to rule. And, to his credit, he tried. Gallienus reformed the army, creating more mobile cavalry units, and promoted talented generals regardless of their background. But he faced endless usurpers, invasions, and rebellions. At one point, 30 different men declared themselves emperor, known as the 30 Tyrants, though the number is exaggerated. Meanwhile, the empire itself was splitting apart. In the West, Postumus broke away and formed the Gallic Empire, ruling Gaul, Britain, and Spain like his own mini-Rome. In the East, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra eventually carved out her own empire. The central government in Rome was shrinking, struggling to survive. Gallienus was eventually assassinated by his own officers. That was the usual retirement plan for Roman emperors by this point. Plagues, invasions, and inflation. As if weak leadership weren't enough, the empire faced wave after wave of crises. Plagues, a massive outbreak, sometimes called the Plague of Cyprin, swept through the empire in the mid-2nd century. Contemporary accounts describe people vomiting, suffering ulcers, and dying rapidly. It devastated populations, weakened armies, and strained economies. Invasions. The Goths, Franks, Alemanni, and other Germanic tribes invaded across the Rhine and Danube. Pirates raided the Mediterranean. In the east, the Sassanids were relentless. Economy. The endless wars and bribes to soldiers emptied the treasury. Emperors debased the coinage, mixing less silver into coins, leading to runaway inflation. Ordinary Romans lost faith in their money. Prices skyrocketed. People turned to barter. Life for the average Roman was grim. Farms abandoned, cities shrinking, roads unsafe. The empire looked like it might actually collapse. The brief glimmers of hope. Amid the chaos, a few emperors stood out as stabilizers. Claudius II Gothicus, who ruled briefly from 260 to 270, defeated the Goths in a major battle, earning his nickname. He restored some confidence before dying of plague. Then came Aurelian, 270 to 275, one of Rome's great unsung heroes. Aurelian was a tough general who reunited the empire. He crushed the Gallic Empire in the west, defeated Queen Zenobia in the east, and brought the provinces back under Roman control. He also built massive new walls around Rome, some of which still stand. People called him Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. But even he couldn't escape the curse. In 275, his own officers murdered him, supposedly after being tricked by a forged letter suggesting he planned to execute them. Rome just couldn't catch a break. The empire at its weakest. By the late 3rd century, Rome had survived, barely. The empire had nearly disintegrated, plagued by foreign invasions, constant civil wars, and economic collapse. But the very fact that it hadn't completely fallen apart was astonishing. The key? The army. For all their backstabbing, Roman soldiers still defended the frontiers, still fought off invasions, still believed in the empire, at least enough to keep it breathing. But everyone knew something had to change. The old system, emperors chosen by accident, murdered by their guards, bought by bribes, wasn't working. Rome needed a new structure, a new order. And that's what the next phase would bring. Reformers who tried to stitch the empire back together. Some succeeded, some failed, but their experiments reshaped Rome forever. The crisis of the 3rd century was a warning shot. Rome could no longer take its survival for granted. The gods of chaos had shown their teeth.